I think we should be very frightened.
Hello and welcome. This is Lockdown TV from UnHerd. So for the past year, we've been following the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Trump story and the American election. Meanwhile, there's been a lot of news happening over in Hong Kong. The situation with the mainland Chinese and the relationship with the Hong Kong authority has got very tense. So much so that one of the most famous and leading advocates for democracy in Hong Kong, Nathan Law, has felt it necessary to move to the UK. He joins us now from London, where he has just set up shop. Hi, Nathan.
Hi. How are you?
Very good, thank you. So I think it would be really helpful to kind of start from the beginning. So you are born in Shenzhen, is that right, on the mainland? But grew up in Hong Kong, and you have one parent from the mainland and one parent from Hong Kong. Is that right?
I was born in mainland China, and it was my family was a very classic China-Hong Kong marriage, which my mother stays in mainland China, and my father was working in Hong Kong because back then the salary of Hong Kong and the condition was far much better than the ones in mainland China. And subsequently, we applied for a reunion program that my mother and I, along with my brothers, moved to Hong Kong when I was 6. And then from that, our families were living together. And that was the background of my story from moving from China to Hong Kong.
Do you have lots of family and friends still in mainland China? Is it very connected?
Not very connected. Actually, I don't really have very close relatives in mainland China, but most of my parents' families are in mainland China, and I have not been in contact with them for a very long time.
So explain to our viewers who might not know, Hong Kong is an island just off the coast of mainland China, but the atmosphere is very different, and it's governed in a different way. I mean, tell us about the differences. You take that short boat ride, and what kind of world awaits on the other side?
Before 1997, Hong Kong was a British colony, which the British government governed that for more than 100 years. And in 1980s, when Chinese government wanted to get Hong Kong back, they had undergone a series of negotiation and discussion with the British government, and they finally fixate a framework of one country, two system, which when Hong Kong was handed back to mainland China in 1997, it would continue its way of life, its governing philosophy, its very different capitalist system compared to the one in mainland China, which was more like a socialist system and one-party ruling, in order to appease Hong Kong people and alleviate their tension about their future. Because when Hong Kong people were hearing about they are going back to the communist ruling, they were frightened in the 80s. And the Chinese government tried to say that nothing would change. It was just a flag, and it was just the name of your country would change, so that they hope Hong Kong people should not be afraid of living under the Chinese flag. But subsequently, as you may see, things changed very rapidly.
How have you seen it change? I mean, you were a young child pretty much at the time when the handover from the British happened. What changes have you seen over the course of your lifetime in Hong Kong?
When Xi Jinping took his power in 2012, it has implemented far more heavy-handed approaches in Hong Kong as the ones he applied it in mainland China. So the Hong Kong-China conflicts became much more worst. And for now, we could see a really different and strange Hong Kong, that our freedom are being deprived, democracy never came, and people are still struggling to have their most basic human rights.
So how does that actually appear in life? So you're at school in Hong Kong, you then go to university in Hong Kong. How does it impact your life? What kind of freedoms do you see curtailed?
You really had the taste of freedom when you were living in Hong Kong at the year 2000 and onward. You could speak freely. On the advertisement, the government suggests that we have got all sorts of freedom. Basic law is protecting us. And for now, you can see everything changed. The cultural landscape is so different. You see, the TV shows, they play national anthem song, teaching you to love your country, love the party, do not do things to break the law, and you could see those kind of national education that dispersed in your curriculum, saying that one party ruling is good, Communist Party at at the interest of people, and a lot of slogans are being banned, a lot of words that you cannot say. And when you said it,
such as what? What can't you say?
Yeah, for example, the slogans of the movement, thoughts brainstorming about the status of Hong Kong, the future of Hong Kong, about its sovereignty. These are being taboo words that you cannot say. There are no rallies allowed. The police are literally banning every single rally application, so you cannot see any like massive gathering on the streets. And for the journalists, they're afraid of being prosecuted. There are already several journalists being prosecuted because they have documented certain topics or certain episodes that the government don't like. There are all sorts of things that pop up in the news, just reminding you that how different Hong Kong now is compared to like 10 years ago.
So when you were a student at a kind of liberal arts college in Hong Kong, you then became a prominent advocate. You were a leading light in the 2014 so-called umbrella protests. Why did you do that? What was it that made you into an activist where many of your fellow students didn't become that? Yeah,
I grew up in quite blue-collar families. My father was a construction worker. My mother was a street cleaner. Participating in politics, becoming a politician or an activist never came into my mind when I was growing up. All I was thinking was trying to get my family's a better life, trying to like be hardworking, getting into university, get a good job, having a family, just like ordinary orthodox way of thinking about my future. But subsequently, when I learned more about the injustice in the society, especially the problems generated from underrepresented government, people's voice are not being heard, that gradually shaped my my mindset about the course of life. Subsequently, I felt like it's more important to change the society than just living your own life. So in Hong Kong's university, there has been a strong tradition that the student union, which is democratically elected by the students in that school, actively engage in social life, in social affairs, in social movement. So by then, when I was getting into the university, I participated in the student union and became the representation of that, and I was involved in the massive civil disobedience student movement in 2014, which we call the Umbrella Movement.
So do you think, I mean, obviously nobody is doing opinion polls of the whole Hong Kong population that are easy to do, but if you could do a perfect opinion survey, what percentage of the entire Hong Kong Chinese population do you think would be behind your movement?
Yeah, we can refer to some pool data about it. In the movement last year, we've got 5 demands. One of them is to have democracy in Hong Kong, and the other is to set up independent investigative committee on the police brutality. And there were polling showing that these 2 demands were getting more than 80% of supporting rate in the society. And you could also refer to the previous election results on the Legislative Council, and the rough guess is around 50 to 60% of them are pro-democracy supporters, and around 20 to 30 of them are quite neutral. They claim themselves as neutral, non-political inclined individuals, and the rest, 20 to 30%, are pro-Beijing, pro-establishment side.
So do you think it's growing? I mean, do you think the propaganda from Beijing, the teaching in the schools, the banning of advocacy, do you think that's having an effect and the pro-Beijing group is growing?
in Hong Kong's context, I think that influence generated from the movement, from the pro-democracy movement, from the resistance movement that we had for the past year, the weight of its impact is much larger than the brainwashing curriculum and those national education carried out by the government. So I guess that kind of political shift has been in favor of the pro-democracy side for the past year. And you could see it in last year's district council election, which the pro-democracy camp had a landslide victory.
So, your own example, I mean, after the 2014 protests, you were then elected to the democratic legislature in Hong Kong, the youngest ever person to be elected. And now, a couple of years later, you find yourself in pretty much self-imposed exile. So I suppose for young people in Hong Kong, they have a big decision to make, whether to proceed with kind of advocacy and saying their views, or whether to play it safe and stay at home.
Well, I guess there are a couple background information that people have to understand in order to digest the current Hong Kong situation. First of all, we have never had a democratic council. Around half of the seats of the council are through direct election, and I had one of the seats in 2016. But another half of that, most of the seats were assigned to the pro-Beijing camp. So even though every general election, the pro-democracy camp had a majority, but in the council we are minority because most of the seats are being reserved to the pro-Beijing camp. So this is a semi-democratic council, and of course can never represent the people. And the second would definitely be, the influence of the national security law has been quite massive in terms of its chilling effects and creating white terror that people are worried about expressing their political opinion because it's a speech crime. They could prosecute people because of what they said and what slogan that they display.
So the national security, just to explain to people, the national security law has been this very controversial piece of legislation, the source of a lot of the protests this year, which is, tell us what's contained within it.
On the 30th of June, the Chinese government circumventing all the local legislation and consultation process and directly imposed a law. Its name is National Security Law in Hong Kong. And the law targets people who conduct so-called subversion, secession, or collusion with foreign forces and to protect national security. But the problem is a vaguely defined law, and it could prosecute people because of what you said or because of what you post online, and is definitely seen as a legal weapon for the government to cook up cases and to arrest prominent activists. So it's seen as a major intrusion to our personal freedom and human rights. And many countries like the US, the UK, the European unions, they have issued statements urging the government to restore the national security law because of its draconian nature. So I fled out of Hong Kong because of the law, and there are news saying that I am on the wanted list of the police under the national security law.
So you left because you didn't feel safe then? You felt you were being followed or you were being observed and would be arrested?
Well, I had been involved in international advocacy work, which was the thing that this law particularly addressed. I had been doing a lot of lobbying work in the US when I was studying at Yale last year, and I had been participating in many conferences and meetings with politicians urging the world to hold China accountable to implement measures and policies that that could do sanctionings and so on and so forth if China still continues its human rights violation in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And under the context of national security law, it is being seen as breaching the national security law, and it's so obvious that they will go after me. So I left at the end of June.
So you mentioned the UK. You mentioned America and the European Union as well, issuing statements condemning the national security law. Well, obviously that didn't have much of an effect. What is your view of how Britain has behaved? Because, Hong Kong was a British overseas territory. We were the ones who signed the agreement, the handover agreement with China. What is the reputation of the UK among your friends and your population in Hong Kong? How do you think we have behaved?
We didn't pay much expectation to the British government because we were kind of having a mindset that is always interest driven for its foreign policy back then, and that kind of perception really quite overwhelming back then. So actually, no one did really pay much attention in the way that the British government would act in accordance to Hong Kong's human rights erosion. But recently, I think I have observed a change on that issue, especially, for example, on the Huawei incident. At the beginning of this year, the government was still saying that they are going to include Huawei in the 5G infrastructure. But after my arrival, there was a bill passed in the parliament saying that the government is actually going to exclude Huawei from its participation, and it has been through an overturn in just 6 months. So I guess it's definitely because of how the political scene in general had reshaped its perception to China and had reviewed its approach in terms of getting into the problems of China's human rights violation, and they decided to adopt a much more assertive and tough measures and policy direction.
You're being kind about your new country, but in reality, the UK has not been successful in pushing back against mainland China. It hasn't defended the terms of its agreement very successfully, and the fact that you've had to emigrate is kind of proof of that, isn't it?
Well, I guess for now I'm in a status of exile. I actually hope that my presence is not a proof of failure, but it's a signal for change. So I have always been really actively engaging in advocacy work that hoping the countries in Europe, like UK, that we could really facilitate and building up consensus across political aisles and to be strong to China and to Hong Kong. And to be honest, I actually pay a lot of understandings towards that kind of a reserved approach for the past decades, because how sophisticated China's espionage and a lot of different infiltrations has been. And I think what is most important is actually we are starting to recognizing that, even though that recognition came quite lately. So I guess by having that awareness, we will definitely work on a much more sophisticated and right direction in order to combat the Chinese authoritarian influence.
So the UK made this big dramatic offer, saying that any holder of a British national overseas passport, which has not historically meant that you had any rights of residency in the UK, would be able to apply for UK residency. What's your take on that? I mean, do you think that offer will be taken up by a lot of people? What's your prediction of how many BNO passport holders might turn up on UK shores?
The new BNO scheme also showed a drastic change of the US government's approach to China and to Hong Kong, which they indeed take concrete policy measures to show their stance. There are 3 million people who are eligible for the scheme, but I don't think there will be that much people picking up that. My estimation would be 100,000 for the first year, and maybe it will gradually decrease along the years.
Because 100,000 next year, you think?
Yeah, I guess it is the maximum, because I think the people who are able to immigrate are middle class people with capital. It's quite difficult for blue collar families in Hong Kong who may not possess the most basic English skills to be moving to the UK and to start their new life, which they don't really have any skilled qualification that could easily grant them a job. And on that regards, if you compare a lot of condition in Hong Kong and in the UK, especially a cultural environment, the vibe of the city, whether you get used to the way of life, I don't think in terms of immigration, I don't think there will be many Hong Kong citizens found it. They really had to pick up the opportunity to completely change their life.
As a Chinese Hong Kong, would you like to see lots of people come, or would you prefer to see people stay where they are?
Well, I think the scheme really provides people who face imminent dangers to have an easy exit. I am really grateful about that because there are lots of people in Hong Kong, they've been arrested, they've been tortured, or they've been intimidated. And some of them are desperately need an exit. So I guess for those people who really face imminent dangers, is a really good scheme for them to protect their own safety. But for ordinary citizens, it's always a complex emotion. You want people to resist on every front. I'm on the international front. I do international advocacy work. But there are people needed in the education sector when there are teachers, they teach the students with the right values, right education, even though they're in a very suppressed environment. We need lawyers who could represent the protesters, even though they face intimidation and face suppression. And we need journalists who report to the truth or as close as to the truth, even though the government has been suppressing the press freedom.
So stories in the British press about hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongese arriving and us building new towns for them in East Anglia and stuff, you think that's us getting a bit carried away and it's not going to happen?
It's a bit dramatized, I guess. But I think it also shows the emotion of that disappointment from Hong Kong people to the current status of Hong Kong. They desperately wanted to copy an old Hong Kong, which was vibrant, was energetic. People feel like they could do whatever they want as long as they are not harming the others. I think people had that nostalgia way of thinking Hong Kong, and that this kind of a little bit more dramatized thinking emerged. So I guess for people coming to the UK, not only we have to preserve that Hong Kong culture and Hong Kong way of life in the bottom of our heart, but we also have to adopt to the culture in the UK society. We have to be assimilated. At least we have to understand who we are living with and respect the culture here. So I guess the process is not as easy as many people may perceive before they had deep contemplation in terms of changing the way of living.
You mentioned culture, and this I'd like to kind of end by talking about that as a broader question, really. I used to work at a survey company, and we did surveys in China, and it was always amazing how kind of uniform the answers would be, even if it was about something that was totally apolitical. And I've always wondered, is it partly a cultural difference? We talk about always, the Chinese Communist Party and the government. What's your experience of the cultural difference there? I mean, do you feel it's a less individualistic society, the Chinese society? What should we understand about it?
Well, I guess there are two parts of that. In terms of how they portray the city or the country in mainland China specifically, they have a strong mindset of very protective way of portraying the country. There is a idiom Chinese saying that we do not broadcast the bad things in our family. So I guess that kind of mindset really influenced people in mainland China, that they want to portray the good things, good side of the society, and they hope that that kind of image could boost their national power and, of course, their confidence. But on the other hand, people are intimidated. They dare not to speak up the truth because of the sophisticated surveillance and monitoring scheme that basically permeate in every level, in every social fabrics of the society. And people have a strong sense that they are being monitored 24/7. I guess there are different ways of really influencing how people think and act. And I guess it will never come. You'll never come to a really represented polling in mainland China due to these sort of reasons.
How frightened do you think we should be in the West of China? I mean, clearly it's had an enormous rise, and people are definitely waking up to the harder edges of that regime, and I think some of the naivety of previous decades is falling away. But how frightened do you think we should be?
I think we should be very frightened. It's not because you could see a clear message of like warfare or invasion, but it's because how we are lacking the knowledge about Hong Kong, about China, and how we are being misguided for a very, very long period of time without really understanding the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the way they act. I think that is the part that made me feel we indeed have loads of work to do, and we indeed have to have a massive scale of research on China's policies, infiltration with the narrative, and how they get into the democracies and dismantle and discredit our way of life and democratic values. I think that kind of urgency emerged because we just don't understand the regime. We're lacking of that knowledge in the political scene. So I guess the main takeaway would definitely be, especially in the UK politics, which had been infiltrated for a very long period of time, that we need to boost our knowledge to mainland China as soon as possible before it's too late.
Well, sobering words. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, Nathan.
Thank you so much.
That was Nathan Law, a democracy advocate from Hong Kong who has just arrived here in the UK, telling us a little bit about his experience in Hong Kong and what we should all be paying attention to from China in the coming years. This was Lockdown TV. Thanks for joining.